Hey guys, Miss Zimmerman here. I wanted to do your lesson today on experimental design. We're going to be talking about how to write your hypothesis, what your variables will be in your experiment, how to write a materials list, and how to write your procedure. So first off, anytime an experiment is being designed, whether you're designing the experiment or if it's already designed for you, there are a couple of things that the experiment should include. First and most importantly, that a good experiment should be testing one thing at a time. You don't want to be testing two different things because you don't know if the result would be due to one of the things that you tested or the other thing that you tested. So if you only test one thing at a time, then you know for sure that the results you get are affected by that particular variable. You want to make sure that you limit any outside factors that could affect the outcome of your experiment. So you want to make sure that it's what we call controlled. And you want to make sure that the data you collect is accurate. Now, 4 parts to your experimental design is going to be your hypothesis, variables, materials list, and procedure. The hypothesis is a very important part to an experiment. It should be based on research, so when you are designing a hypothesis, it should not just be a random guess. You should have some sort of research to back up your potential thought. Usually it's going to be written as an if, then, because statement. For example, if different sized footballs are thrown, then the largest football will travel the furthest distance because it has a higher mass. So when you write a hypothesis, the if part of this statement is if I do this. So in this experiment, what are they doing? They're going to be throwing different sized footballs. Okay, it's what they're doing. The then is what you think is going to happen. So if they throw different sized footballs, then they think the largest one will travel the furthest distance. So the then part of your statement is a guess of what you think is going to happen. And then the because part of the statement supports your guess because it has a higher mass. So the if, then, because statement is your hypothesis. The if is, if I do this, then this will happen because this is why I think so. Okay? When you write that if, then, because statement, you want to make sure that you use clear, simple language. It should be an explanation, and it has to be testable. Okay, if you can't test a hypothesis, then there's no point in writing one. You want to make sure that you choose one that you can design an experiment around. And that hypothesis is also going to define what your independent and dependent variables are. Now, if we look at the variables, a variable is anything that changes or is a factor within the experiment. And there are 3 major kinds. You have your independent variable, which we usually annotate with an IV, your dependent variable, which we annotate with a DV, and your controlled variable, which we annotate with a CV. We use these abbreviations just so we don't have to write out those long words every single time. So anytime you see an IV, we're talking about independent variable. If you see a DV, we're talking about dependent variable. And if you see CV, we're talking about controlled variable. Now, the independent variable is the factor that you intentionally change in the experiment. So it is what you are testing. So if we look at this example experiment here, if you are testing to see which liquid would melt an ice cube the quickest, your independent variable is the type of liquid because you are changing which liquid that you're using to see what would melt the ice cube. Now, independent variables, usually you're going to test about 3 or 4 different ones. If we were looking back at the ice cube example, you could be testing water, soda, milk, bleach, ammonia, anything that's in liquid form. But you want to make sure that you have enough to test, but you don't want to be testing too many. If you have 15 or 16 different groupings, that's a little bit too much. You want to make sure that you stay somewhere around 3 to 4 different changes to the independent variable. The dependent variable is what you're observing or measuring in the experiment. I always like to think of it as the data that you're collecting, the numbers you're collecting, or the observations that you're making. So if we were looking at our ice cube example, how could you observe and measure this? What would be your dependent variable? I want you to pause this and write down what you think the dependent variable would be. All right, what did you write down? If you wrote down the rate at which the ice cube melts, you'd be correct. That would be our dependent variable. You would be measuring how quickly that ice cube melts, whether it's in seconds, minutes, or hours. You would need to pick which one of those you would be measuring it in. Okay, and that brings us to the next part of this dependent variable. You need to think about how are you going to measure those tools and what unit you're going to be measuring in it. So if we were using the ice cube example, what tools would you need to use? I would probably think maybe a stopwatch. And the unit of measurement, seconds doesn't really make sense. It's going to take a little bit longer for an ice cube to melt. Hours is a little bit long, so I would probably be measuring this in minutes. Now, if we wanted to do another experiment where we were looking for plant growth, there's multiple ways that you could measure that. You could do the height of the plant. If you look, if this is in centimeters, you always want to make sure in science that you're using the metric system. So we wouldn't be measuring in inches or feet. We would be measuring in centimeters or meters. You can measure the mass of the plant in grams, which would show that it got bigger because it gained more mass. Or you could even count the number of leaves. That would be useful in showing how plants grow. Okay. Controlled variables, also called constants. Those are anything that you keep the same between all of your different groups. So if we were looking at the ice and liquid example, the amount of liquid that you used for each of your groups would have to be the same. The cup that you used would have to be the same. The number of ice cubes that you used would have to be the same. Those are all controlled variables. And you're always going to have many controlled variables. There's not just going to be one. This controlled variables is important to making sure that you are keeping everything the same within your experiment and not just and making sure that you're testing just one independent variable. This down here is an example. Bad controlled variables, plants receive the same amount of water. This is bad because it doesn't give us too many details. You know, a good example of a controlled variable would be that plants receive 100 milliliters of water each night. That tells us exactly how much water we're using in this particular experiment. Okay. You also have something called a control group that is not a controlled variable. A controlled group is a group within the experiment that's used as a comparison and represents normal conditions. So if you're testing the effect of different liquids on plant growth, the plants receiving water would be your control group because that's what plants normally get. And then you could go on and test, you know, soda or orange juice or milk or whatever. So the control group is the group that is under normal conditions. Whatever that typically receives is what you'll have. And it's important to remember that not all experiments are going to have a control. All right. Now your materials list, simple, should always be bulleted, should include amounts and details. So if you only need one stopwatch, you need to write stopwatch. If you need multiple stopwatches, you need to tell me how many. 6, 7, 8 stopwatches. Don't include materials like pen and paper. Those aren't actually part of your experiment. You are just including materials that you are using in that experiment. So always include amounts and details about all of the materials and tools that you are going to need. So instead of writing water, you might want to write 100 milliliters of tap water. Instead of writing magnets, you might want to write 5 neodymium magnets. Okay? Use these details. If you just say graduated cylinder, I don't know what size, I don't know what kind. So you need to make sure that you include that. Now the procedure, everyone always has a difficult time writing a procedure. Procedure must be written out in numbered steps, kind of like a recipe that your family uses to make your grandma's favorite chocolate chip cookies. Okay? Do not make your first step gather all materials, and your last step should not be clean up. You want to make sure that you just start your procedure with what's the first thing that you do. Okay? Each step should start with an action verb. So measure 50 milliliters of water, or weigh the size of the paper. Okay? Always should be an action step, and each new action needs a new step. Don't combine multiple steps into one. So you should not say measure 50 milliliters of water and pour into the beaker. You would say step number 1 would be measure 50 milliliters of water. Step number 2, pour into beaker. In your procedure, you need to make sure how many times you repeat this experiment. Okay, the more times you repeat it, the better. And the procedure should be specific and clear enough that somebody else who had never done this experiment before can do the experiment and understand how to set it up and gather their data. And then you need to make sure that you answer your research question and test your hypothesis within your procedure. All right, so if we looked at the question, research question, does the brand of soda affect the height of Mentos eruptions? Okay, a possible hypothesis could be if Mentos are dropped into different sodas, then Diet Coke will create the highest Mentos eruption. Now, tell me, what do you see wrong with this hypothesis? What is it missing? I want you to write down on your paper what this hypothesis is missing. If you said because, you'd be correct. You want to make sure you have your because statement in here. Why do you think Diet Coke will create the highest eruption? Because Diet Coke contains aspartame? I don't know, that could be part of the hypothesis. Independent variable. Remember, this is what we are testing or what we are changing. So we are changing the brand of soda. That's our dependent variable. Your dependent variable, and that's your independent variable. Your dependent variable is what we're measuring. You're going to be measuring the height of the eruption in centimeters. Okay, controlled variables are everything you're keeping the same. The size of the bottle, the number of Mentos we use, the same measuring tool, the same temperature of soda. Okay, anything you keep the same between the Diet Coke trial, the Diet Pepsi, the Diet Root Beer, the Diet Dr. Pepper, those are all controlled. Materials list. What do you see? Bulleted. Tells us what we need. Tells us how many we need. That's good. Okay, that is a good materials list. And then you look at your procedure. They all start with action verbs. Place, 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 unscrew, place. Okay, place a piece of tape at every meter mark that you move up the wall until you reach 4 meters high. Place an unopened bottle of Diet Coke on the ground directly next to the wall. Place 3 Mentos into the test tube. Okay, this experiment is nicely set up because of the procedure. You would be very easily able to follow this. Okay, I hope that helps. See you tomorrow. Bye.